They called it the Jug. It was too big, too heavy, too ugly to win a dogfight. On paper, it shouldn't have survived the skies over Europe. Yet again and again, American pilots climbed out of shattered cockpits, walked away from aircraft riddled with holes, and said the same thing. She brought me home. German pilots feared it. Ground troops depended on it. And the men who flew it trusted it with their lives. So why did World War II pilots love the P-47 Thunderbolt so much? Because this wasn't just a fighter. It was a flying tank. And in the deadliest air war in history, it refused to die. In the winter of 1943, the sky over Europe had a sound that German soldiers came to recognize before they ever saw it. It was not the high, sharp whine of a lightweight interceptor. It was not the smooth hum of a distant escort fighter. It was a deep, rolling thunder, a mechanical growl that seemed to shake the air itself. That sound belonged to the P-47 Thunderbolt. To the men who flew it, it was simply the Jug. The nickname wasn't glamorous. It came from the aircraft's shape, bulky fuselage, wide belly, and massive nose housing one of the most powerful radial engines ever mounted on a single-engine fighter. Compared to sleek European designs, it looked oversized, heavy, almost clumsy. But war has a way of rewriting first impressions. When the United States entered the Second World War, American pilots faced a harsh reality in the skies above Europe. The Luftwaffe was experienced, battle-hardened, and aggressive. Aircraft like the Messerschmitt Bf 109 and Focke-Wulf 190 were formidable opponents. They climbed fast. They turned tight. They were built for precision air combat. The early American fighters struggled at high altitude, especially during long-range bomber escort missions deep into enemy territory. Heavy bombers were being shredded by interceptors. Crews were dying in the freezing thin air over Germany. What the United States needed was not just a fighter. It needed endurance. It needed altitude performance. It needed firepower. And above all, it needed survivability. The answer arrived not as a sleek duelist, but as a machine built around power. At the heart of the Thunderbolt was the Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp, an 18-cylinder, twin-row radial engine capable of producing over 2,000 horsepower. This engine wasn't merely powerful, it was durable. Radial engines could absorb punishment that liquid-cooled inline engines often could not. When struck by bullets, they were less likely to catastrophically fail. To protect the pilot, the aircraft carried thick armor plating and a bullet-resistant windscreen. Behind the cockpit sat reinforced bulkheads. The fuel tanks were self-sealing. The airframe was robust, almost overbuilt by contemporary standards. Then there were the guns. 8.50 caliber Browning machine guns, 4 in each wing. When a Thunderbolt fired a full burst, it unleashed a wall of metal capable of shredding fighters, locomotives, armored vehicles, and troop concentrations alike. But none of that explains love. Pilots do not love aircraft because they are powerful on paper. They love them because they live. In training, many American aviators initially underestimated the Thunderbolt. It felt heavy in turns. It demanded discipline in energy management. It punished careless maneuvering. But in combat, something changed. The Jug could dive faster than almost anything in the sky. Its weight became an advantage. In a steep dive, the Thunderbolt transformed from bulky escort into unstoppable missile. German fighters learned quickly. If a P-47 committed to a dive attack, outrunning it was nearly impossible. And if the Thunderbolt was hit, it kept flying. There are documented accounts of aircraft returning to base with entire cylinders shot away, wings perforated by flak, control surfaces partially destroyed. Pilots landed machines that, by all engineering logic, should have disintegrated in midair. Ground crews would stare at the damage in disbelief. Pilots would simply shrug and say, "She brought me back." This is where the affection began. In the cold mathematics of aerial warfare, statistics matter. Loss ratios, sorties flown, bomb tonnage delivered. But inside the cockpit, statistics disappear. What remains is trust, a bond between pilot and machine formed in moments when the sky is filled with tracers and the engine is the only sound separating life from death. By mid-1943, Thunderbolts were escorting heavy bombers deep into occupied Europe. They climbed to altitudes above 30,000 feet, where oxygen masks froze and metal became brittle. They fought through flak storms and fighter interceptions. They absorbed damage and continued flying. And when fuel ran low, they turned for home, often still carrying scars from the fight. The Thunderbolt's reputation spread not only among American squadrons, but also among enemy pilots and Allied ground troops. German airmen reportedly referred to it as one of the hardest Allied fighters to shoot down. It could sustain extraordinary structural stress in high-speed dives. Attempts to follow it into a vertical plunge sometimes resulted in catastrophic failure for lighter aircraft. On the ground, Allied infantry came to depend on the Thunderbolt's arrival. When the distinctive radial roar echoed overhead, it meant close air support was imminent. Bridges, armored columns, supply trains, nothing was safe once Thunderbolts rolled in. But before it became the terror of the battlefield, before it earned its reputation as the premier American fighter bomber of the European theater, the Thunderbolt had to prove itself. And it did so in fire. The early missions were brutal. Bomber formations still suffered losses. Escort ranges were initially limited before the introduction of external drop tanks. Pilots learned through trial, error, and blood. They learned to fight vertically instead of horizontally. They learned to conserve energy. They learned to use altitude as a weapon. The Thunderbolt was not a ballet dancer. It was a heavyweight boxer. It did not pirouette around opponents. It struck hard, disengaged, and struck again. Those who adapted survived. Those who survived began to speak of it differently. By 1944, as Allied forces prepared for the invasion of Western Europe, the Thunderbolt had evolved from escort fighter into multi-role workhorse. It carried bombs under its wings. It launched rockets at armored divisions. It strafed enemy airfields. It escorted bombers. It dueled interceptors. It did everything. And it did it while bringing its pilots home. In squadron briefings across England, young men, some barely 20 years old, climbed into the cockpits of their Thunderbolts knowing the odds. The skies over Europe were unforgiving. Flak bursts could tear a wing off in seconds. Enemy fighters lurked near bomber formations. Mechanical failure at altitude meant freezing death or capture. Yet again and again, when given a choice between aircraft types, many pilots preferred the Jug. Not because it was the fastest climber, not because it turned the tightest, but because it endured. Love, in wartime aviation, is not romance. It is reliability under fire. The Thunderbolt was not the prettiest fighter of the war. Even some American pilots joked about its size and weight. Compared to sleeker contemporaries, it looked almost industrial, a machine built more for survival than elegance. But war rarely rewards elegance alone. It rewards resilience. And resilience was precisely what the Thunderbolt embodied. In muddy forward airstrips carved from French fields after D-Day, ground crews patched bullet holes with sheet metal and rivets. Engines were serviced overnight. By dawn, the Jug was airborne again, roaring low over hedgerows, hunting targets in support of advancing Allied troops. It became synonymous with destruction from above. And yet, for the men strapped inside, it meant protection. As the war intensified, stories multiplied. A Thunderbolt returning with half its tail assembly damaged. Another landing with hydraulic systems destroyed, pilot wrestling manual controls. One flying nearly 200 miles on a crippled engine. These were not myths. They were after-action reports. Each one reinforced a belief. If you were going to be shot at, and in Europe, you would be, there were worse machines to be sitting in. The Thunderbolt earned affection not through propaganda, but through repetition, through survival, through the simple, brutal arithmetic of men who came back when they statistically should not have. In hangars and barracks, pilots spoke about it in personal terms. They patted the fuselage before missions. They named their aircraft. They painted nose art beneath the cockpit, symbols of identity in a mechanized war. The Jug became more than aluminum and rivets. It became a guardian. By the final year of the war, the Thunderbolt would fly tens of thousands of sorties. It would destroy enemy aircraft in the air and on the ground. It would devastate supply lines. It would escort bombers over Berlin. and it would absorb punishment that would have destroyed lesser aircraft. But its story is not merely one of engineering success. It is the story of trust forged under extreme pressure. It is the story of young men who discovered that sometimes the heaviest machine in the sky was also the safest place to be. And as the thunder of its engine rolled across occupied Europe, a simple truth became clear. The P-47 Thunderbolt was not loved because it was perfect. It was loved because it refused to let its pilots die easily. By early 1944, the skies above Europe had become an industrial battlefield. Every morning, heavy bombers from the United States Army Air Forces climbed into the gray horizon from bases in England. Their targets were deep inside the German war machine: ball-bearing factories, oil refineries, rail hubs, aircraft plants. The problem was simple. Bombers could destroy industry, but they could not defend themselves forever. That responsibility fell to escort fighters. Among them, increasingly, was the P-47 Thunderbolt, the long escort. At 25,000 feet, the world was colorless and lethal. The bomber formations of the B-17 Flying Fortress and B-24 Liberator moved in tight combat boxes, bristling with defensive guns. Frost formed along the inside of canopies. Oxygen masks hissed steadily. Engines droned with mechanical persistence. The Thunderbolts flew above and around them. Early in the war, escort range was a severe limitation. Without external fuel tanks, fighters were forced to turn back before bombers reached their deepest targets. German interceptors would wait until that moment, then strike. The introduction of drop tanks changed the geometry of the air war. Now, Thunderbolts could go farther. Now they could stay. And when the Luftwaffe climbed to challenge the bomber streams, they met something far more resilient than expected. German fighters such as the Messerschmitt Bf 109 and Focke-Wulf Fw 190 were agile and dangerous. Their pilots were seasoned veterans of campaigns stretching back to Poland and France. In a turning contest, the Thunderbolt could be at a disadvantage. But American pilots learned quickly: do not turn with them. Disengage. The Jug's weight, nearly 7 tons fully loaded, became its secret weapon. In a steep dive, it accelerated like a dropped hammer. Control surfaces remained responsive even as airspeed climbed into regions where other fighters risked structural failure. German pilots discovered that pursuing a diving Thunderbolt could mean catastrophic overspeed. The Jug would plunge, level out, and climb again, ready for another pass. It was not elegant combat. It was disciplined violence. The dive that changed everything. One of the defining characteristics of the Thunderbolt was its ability to absorb velocity. With its rugged airframe and thick wings, it could exceed 500 miles per hour in a dive. Compressibility, an aerodynamic phenomenon that caused control stiffening at high speeds, affected all high-altitude fighters. But the P-47 handled it better than many contemporaries. Pilots learned to use vertical separation as a shield. If overwhelmed, dive. If attacking, dive. If pursued, dive. Again and again, the Thunderbolt proved that speed could be defense as much as offense. There were instances where P-47s returned to England with wings perforated, fuselages torn open by cannon fire, and engines coughing smoke, yet still airborne. Ground crews began informally competing to count the bullet holes. In some cases, over 200 strikes were documented on a single returning aircraft. The Jug's massive radial engine, the Pratt and Whitney R-2800 double Wasp, was air-cooled. Unlike liquid-cooled engines, it did not rely on a vulnerable radiator system that could be disabled by a single well-placed shot. Damage that would doom other fighters could be survivable in a Thunderbolt. Pilots noticed. They talked. And trust grew. Black flak and burning sky. Escort duty was only the beginning. As Allied strategy shifted toward preparing for the invasion of Western Europe, the Thunderbolt's role evolved. It became a fighter bomber. By mid-1944, P-47 squadrons were carrying bombs under their wings, 500-pounders, sometimes even 1,000-pound loads. Later, they would carry rockets capable of punching through armored vehicles. When Operation Overlord began on June 6, 1944, Thunderbolts were overhead. The beaches of Normandy were chaos. naval bombardment, artillery, machine gun fire, smoke obscuring landmarks. As Allied troops fought to establish footholds, the Jug roared in low. At low altitude, the war felt different. No longer abstract formations against blue sky. Now it was hedgerows, villages, moving columns, muzzle flashes from concealed positions. Thunderbolt pilots began specializing in close air support. They would drop to treetop level, scanning for movement. When they spotted German convoys or armored concentrations, they attacked in pairs, one diving to release bombs or fire rockets, the other covering. 8.50 caliber machine guns could tear through trucks, locomotives, and lightly armored vehicles with terrifying efficiency. German soldiers developed a grim familiarity with the sound of the radial engine approaching at low altitude. Some called it Jabo-ter, short for Jagbomber. Thunderbolts would strike supply lines relentlessly. Rail yards were shredded. Fuel depots ignited in towering columns of flame. Retreating columns along French roads were strafed into wreckage. By the late summer of 1944, as German forces withdrew across France, the Thunderbolt had become one of the most feared aircraft on the battlefield. The human factor. Yet statistics alone do not explain love. Inside the cockpit, at 15,000 feet or 500 feet, the pilot's world narrowed to instruments, engine noise, and instinct. The Thunderbolt cockpit was relatively spacious compared to some fighters. Visibility was adequate, though early models had framed razorback canopies that limited rearward sightlines. Later bubble canopy variants improved this significantly. The aircraft required strength. It was not overly forgiving. It demanded anticipation in maneuvers. But it rewarded discipline. Pilots often described the Jug as stable, a steady gun platform. When lining up a strafing run or firing at an enemy aircraft, its weight dampened excessive wobble. It felt solid. Solid was comforting. In war, comfort is rare. One veteran later summarized it bluntly, "I never worried about whether my airplane could take it. I only worried about whether I could." That distinction mattered. Aircraft like the P-51 Mustang would later gain fame for range and agility. The Mustang became legendary in its own right. But many pilots who transitioned between types remembered the Thunderbolt with a specific kind of affection. The Mustang was elegant. The Thunderbolt was stubborn. And stubbornness keeps you alive. Duel in the clouds. Despite its growing ground attack role, the Thunderbolt never abandoned air superiority. Throughout 1944, as Allied bombing intensified, the Luftwaffe launched desperate interception efforts. Some missions turned into brutal dogfights above the Reich. In these encounters, Thunderbolt squadrons used altitude advantage and coordinated tactics. They attacked from above, broke formation, engaged, and regrouped. The Jug's firepower was decisive. 8.50 caliber machine guns firing in convergence could shred enemy fighters in seconds. A brief burst often sufficed. German pilots respected the Thunderbolt's ability to absorb punishment. Accounts exist of Luftwaffe airmen expressing frustration after seeing P-47s continue flying despite significant damage. The Jug was not invincible. Many were lost. But it was forgiving. And forgiveness in combat aviation translates to survival probability. Winter of attrition. By late 1944, during the German counteroffensive known as the Battle of the Bulge, weather grounded aircraft for days. When the skies finally cleared, Thunderbolts launched in waves. They attacked armored spearheads, artillery positions, and supply routes. Low clouds forced them to operate in marginal visibility. Anti-aircraft fire intensified as German forces fought desperately to maintain momentum. The Jug's rugged construction once again proved decisive. Aircraft returned with flak holes in wings and fuselage, sometimes with entire sections of control surface fabric missing. Ground crews patched them overnight. By morning, they flew again. This operational tempo, relentless sortie generation under harsh conditions, was only possible because the airframe tolerated abuse. Pilots internalized that reliability. They began to view the Thunderbolt not as equipment, but as partner. The psychological edge. Beyond performance metrics, the P-47 offered something intangible: psychological resilience. Pilots who believe in their aircraft fight differently. They take calculated risks. They commit to attack runs. They maintain composure when hit. The Thunderbolt's track record created confidence. Confidence improves decision-making under stress. Improved decision-making increases survival. This feedback loop strengthened affection into loyalty. Even when newer, sleeker fighters entered service, many squadrons continued flying the Jug with pride. Its reputation had already been earned. From escort to executioner. As 1945 approached and Allied air superiority became overwhelming, Thunderbolts shifted heavily toward ground interdiction. Rail networks across Germany were crippled. Fuel shortages worsened. Mobility collapsed. Thunderbolt pilots hunted anything that moved. Columns of retreating vehicles were attacked repeatedly. Bridges were destroyed to prevent regrouping. Airfields were strafed to eliminate remaining German aircraft on the ground. By war's end, the P-47 had flown over 500,000 sorties. It had destroyed thousands of enemy aircraft, both in air combat and on the ground. It had obliterated tens of thousands of vehicles and locomotives. But those numbers, impressive as they are, only partially explain its legacy. The deeper reason pilots loved it lies in a simpler statistic: return rate. Time after time, Thunderbolts brought their pilots home. Even crippled. Even burning. Even barely holding altitude. The Jug might not have been the most glamorous aircraft of the war. But glamour does not matter at 20,000 feet with tracer fire climbing toward you. Survival does. And the P-47 Thunderbolt built its reputation not in advertisements or headlines, but in the quiet moment after landing, when a pilot climbed down, touched the scarred aluminum skin, and realized he was still alive. By the spring of 1945, the sound of thunder over Europe had become familiar. It no longer signaled desperate defense. It signaled inevitability. The P-47 Thunderbolt had flown through nearly every phase of America's air war in Europe: escort fighter, air superiority platform, dive attacker, tank hunter, close air support guardian. It had adapted without complaint. It had endured without elegance. And when the war ended, it did not demand celebration. It simply sat on airfields across England, France, and Germany, scarred, oil-streaked, and victorious. The measure of an aircraft. Military aviation history often gravitates toward sleekness and speed. The P-51 Mustang is remembered for range and refinement. The British Supermarine Spitfire for agility and beauty. The Thunderbolt was different. It was not built around grace. It was built around tolerance. Tolerance for stress. Tolerance for damage. Tolerance for mistakes. Young pilots, some barely trained beyond stateside instruction, were thrown into the most violent airspace in history. They made errors. They misjudged angles. They were surprised by flak bursts and ambushed by unseen fighters. In many aircraft, those mistakes were fatal. In the Jug, they were sometimes survivable. That distinction shaped memory. The return. In countless memoirs and interviews, former Thunderbolt pilots describe a similar moment. The engine has been hit. Oil pressure is dropping. Hydraulics are failing. The aircraft vibrates under structural strain. Yet the R-2800 radio continues to roar. The pilot turns west, toward the channel. That stretch of water became a dividing line between life and capture. Reaching it meant hope. Crossing it meant survival was possible. Many did not make it, but many did. And when wheels touched English soil again, the bond between pilot and aircraft deepened into something close to gratitude. The Jug did not promise invincibility. It offered a fighting chance. Fear on the ground. By late 1944, German ground forces had developed their own understanding of the Thunderbolt. The deep radial engine note at low altitude meant imminent attack. The aircraft's ability to carry bombs and rockets, then strafe with 8.50 caliber machine guns, made it devastating against columns on roads and rail. As Allied armies pushed east, Thunderbolts systematically dismantled mobility. Fuel trucks exploded. Bridges collapsed. Retreating units scattered. The Thunderbolt's transformation from high-altitude escort to low-level executioner was not accidental. Its durability made it ideal for flying through small arms fire and light anti-aircraft bursts that would cripple more delicate designs. Even when hit, it often stayed in the fight. That reliability amplified its psychological effect. To Allied troops, it was reassurance. To German troops, it was dread. Numbers and reality. By the end of the war in Europe, the Thunderbolt had flown more than 500,000 sorties. It accounted for thousands of enemy aircraft destroyed in air combat and even more on the ground. It devastated infrastructure. It provided close air support during pivotal operations, including Operation Overlord and the counteroffensive against the Battle of the Bulge. But raw statistics obscure the more important metric: survival rates. The P-47's loss rate per sortie compared favorably with many contemporaries, particularly during ground attack missions where exposure to anti-aircraft fire was intense. It absorbed punishment that would have torn apart lighter aircraft. That mattered, not just strategically, but personally. Because behind every statistic was a pilot climbing down from a cockpit. After the guns fell silent. When the war ended, the Thunderbolt did not vanish overnight. It continued service in various air forces around the world. It flew in post-war conflicts. It transitioned into the emerging United States Air Force before being gradually replaced by jet-powered aircraft. Technology moved forward rapidly. Jets promised speed beyond anything propeller-driven fighters could achieve. The era of piston engine dominance faded. But memory did not fade as quickly. Veterans gathered at reunions and air shows decades later would still refer to the Jug with a certain tone, half pride, half affection. They did not describe it as beautiful. They described it as dependable. In aviation, that word carries weight. The machine and the man. Combat aviation is uniquely intimate. A tank crew shares armor. Infantry share trenches. But a fighter pilot sits alone. Alone in a narrow cockpit. Alone with engine noise. Alone with decision-making that unfolds in seconds. In that isolation, trust becomes everything. The Thunderbolt earned that trust through repetition. Through bullet holes that did not end the flight. Through dives that did not tear the wings away. Through engines that continued running when logic suggested they should cease. It did not guarantee survival. No aircraft could. But it reduced the margin of randomness. And in war, even a slight reduction in randomness can mean life. Why they loved it. So why did World War II pilots love the P-47 Thunderbolt so much? Not because it was the fastest. Not because it turned the tightest. Not because it was the most glamorous. They loved it because it was honest. It demanded discipline. It rewarded skill. It forgave imperfection. It did not promise heroics. It offered resilience. When flak burst black around them and tracer fire arced upward, pilots did not need beauty. They needed strength. The Jug gave them that. Legacy of thunder. Today, restored Thunderbolts sit in museums and occasionally take to the sky at air shows. Their radial engines still produce that unmistakable rolling growl. Modern audiences see polished aluminum and carefully painted nose art. But the real story lies beneath the shine. In 1943 and 1944, that same aircraft carried young men into the deadliest airspace on Earth, and often carried them back. It bridged the gap between strategy and survival, between industrial production and human endurance, between machine and trust. History sometimes celebrates the elegant and the revolutionary. The Thunderbolt was neither. It was something more grounded. It was reliable. And in a war defined by chaos, reliability became love. The sky over Europe no longer echoes with radial thunder. But in the memory of those who flew it, and in the quiet reverence of aviation history, the P-47 Thunderbolt remains what it always was. A heavyweight fighter. A flying shield. And for thousands of American pilots, the reason they came home.